and welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm with eLearning Brothers. Today, our session will be about learning theories. So if you're here to learn about learning theories, get ready because we've got a great presentation for you. This session will be recorded. We'll get a copy of it sent out to everyone who has registered, so you can be looking for that in your email later today. If you have questions or comments during the webinar, or if you'd like to participate one way or the other, please do use the questions panel. You'll find that in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll try to get to as many of your questions and comments as we can. If there are some that we aren't able to get to, we'll try to answer those offline. All right, so to talk to us today, we have Brandy Jenkins, one of our senior instructional designers with us. Thanks, Brandy, for your time. And I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Brandy Jenkins. I am an instructional designer with the eLearning Brothers. I picked this topic today because as an instructional designer, one of the first things that I wanted to know about was, as I got more into e-learning, was how I use these theories in an e-learning experience. Because a lot of them, when you first look at them, they seem more gauged toward instructor-led experiences. So today I want to start by talking about a few of the basic theories and ways that you can use them in an online experience. So let's get started with a little question about kind of just to gauge your experience with learning theories, particularly towards online experiences. You may be new to instructional design and not have used theories a whole lot in your design processes, or maybe you're new to learning theories for online learning, or maybe you've taken a few instructional design courses but haven't really used them in an online experience, or maybe there's some other experiences that you've had that you'd like to tell us about. You should go ahead and just enter your comments in the poll.
Yep, there's the poll right on the screen, so you can click directly on there for the poll, but do use that questions panel for your other thoughts. It looks like a good portion of you have already participated, but as those are still coming in, one of the comments coming in here as far as thoughts: webinars, blog posts, articles on professional sites, masters in ISD, baptism of fire, sink or swim with ILT and ID. Have used learning theories in my other career in higher ed, master in instructional technology, masters in ISD. So we've got quite a few people with a lot of experience here. I'll go ahead and close the poll and show those results to you, Brandy. So okay, 62% of our audience has taken instructional design courses. 13% are new to learning theories, 11% are new to instructional design, and then 14% have commented into that questions panel. So we've got quite a spread, but 62%, that's quite a few that have taken instructional design courses.
Sure, that's great, and those are certainly will be helpful as you think more deeply about how you'll use instructional design theories in your online courses. So one of the theories that I wanted to focus on today was cognitive load. This is generally a good theory to keep in mind as you're designing any learning experience, but especially for your online learning experiences where your learners are accessing various types of media in that kind of contained environment of an e-learning course or an online course. So you really do need to keep in mind how their memory works and kind of what information you expose them to in that course. With this theory, going back to the very basics, it started with John Sweller. He believed that humans have a limited short-term working memory with an unlimited long-term memory. For online learning in particular, this is good to keep in mind as far as using concepts like content chunking, and as far as organizing what information you will be presenting to the learners in the course. Looking at cognitive load in more detail, a key point to remember is this magic number 7. Sweller believed that working memory can only hold up to 7 plus or minus 2 items for retrieval, and what he meant by that were bits or chunks of information at a time. And some of that goes back to schemas that learners form as they're recalling, as they're going through the courses, and we'll get into schemas here in a minute. Sweller did define cognitive load in terms of 3 forms. He talked about intrinsic load, which is the demand made of a learner by the quality of the information, and extraneous load was the demand that resulted from the learners by the instruction. That in an online experience would be your things like your navigation and instructions, and the complexity of the content that you're presenting, or complexity of the activity, the interactivity that you're presenting. Germane load occurs as schemas are constructed. So for instructional designers, the key with these is to organize them in the course in a way that optimizes learning. And that is in a way that builds upon their schemas. When you look at different types of schemas, these are events that often happen in everyday life that instructional designers may not, or that learners experience without really sometimes even having to learn them. One of them may be an event like an interview or a meeting with a colleague. There are natural rules of professionalism that a learner follows for these events. What do I wear? What do I say? Do I greet them with a handshake? So these, when you're aware of how a learner relies on these schemas, you can organize that information in the experience in a way that is optimal for them to grasp the material and transfer it to their workplace. A social schema is another type of schema that, learners learn this without really even thinking about it. So, they learn it from their experience, from their interaction with their culture, their families. It's the rules of, do I pay for this dinner for this colleague, or, do I say this to my colleague if I'm out to dinner with them or not? These are different rules that they'll rely on their past experiences to shape these schemas. So looking at schema, this kind of aligns also with schema theory, which I'll present some information on that a little bit later. Schemas are beneficial for the learning process because they influence attention. They impact how quickly people learn. They help to facilitate quick thinking. And they help to simplify the world because people are relying on their past experiences to gauge what they do with new information. And they are beneficial in managing cognitive load. And one way that can be done is by making sure that content is chunked in a way that will help learners form those schemas. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Another way is by your organization of graphics and imagery on the screen. That also will be covered in a little bit more detail as we go as well. So one question that I have for you guys as we get deeper into these theories is, can instructional designs be organized in a way that changes schemas? And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. So if you go ahead and enter your response in the poll setup, we'll take a look at this in a little bit more depth as well.
Go ahead and click right on the screen, just yes or no. We'll give you just a couple more seconds to vote. There's definitely a clear winner here as people are clicking on the screen and voting in the poll. All right, we'll close that in 3, 2, 1. All right, so 93% said yes, 7% said no.
Okay, that's great. So the correct answer, as you guys may have guessed, because I've kind of gave you the answer a little bit earlier, is that yes, we can organize our instructional designs in a way that does change schemas, and that's one of the influence opportunities that we have as instructional designers, is to change those, especially in a working environment where they need to be able to change those to perform their jobs better. Schemas can be remarkably difficult to change because people often cling to their existing schemas, but it is possible to intentionally put strategies into an instructional design to use tactics such as assimilation and accommodation to help learners incorporate that new information into their pre-existing schemas so that they are taking that knowledge to a different level. So for instructional designers, this means that understanding principles like cognitive load and cognitive media theory is helpful to optimize the learning experience in a way that helps learners take that information and apply it to the real world and understand it in a way that is real and relevant to them. And here are a couple of strategies that experts use to manage cognitive load. When it comes to extraneous load versus intrinsic load versus germane load, the strategy that as instructional designers we need to follow is to minimize extraneous load, manage intrinsic load, and maximize germane load. One of the ways that we can do this is by avoiding elements that distract the learners and that overcomplicate the learning process. Another way is to balance out the load in a way that helps the learners manage the complexity of the project. And we'll go into more detail here in a second as I keep going about specific ideas for doing this in an online experience. And lastly, to maximize germane load, design an experience using the right mix of techniques and tools. And what that means is that it's more than just content checking or using pictures with words, and you'll see some of that, or narration with audio. You may, for an online experience, use a combination of different theories to design, each of the chunks of content or each of the chunks of information so that you're targeting different channels of the learners, but you're also maintaining their interest and keeping it interesting and engaging. I've once had an instructional designer to try to convince me that they could only use one theory for a course, and that's not right. So that they were confusing ADDIE model and things like that with theories, which are two different processes. For when it comes to immersing learners in a learning experience, you want to think about how you can use different theories for different types of information to help your learners at a deeper level, help them immerse them in that experience at a deeper level so that they really are achieving the goals of the training. And guys, I do apologize if you see a cat. I had thought I kicked him out, but I didn't. So he has been jumping on the table. So you may see a cat every once in a while. I do apologize for that. So here are some additional strategies for reducing cognitive load in online learning. One of them is to break the content into smaller segments. Usually for online, an e-learning course, one of the baseline I used for a segment of content is 7 minutes or less. There is some theory behind that target number because of just how long a learner in an online environment will keep their attention. One way to do that is to use menus in your course, and I'll show you an example here in a second. Another way is like a test out option that will, it's more of an adaptive format that will allow learners to only see what topics they need to see, what topics they haven't tested out of. Another way is to going back to, if you want to gamify it. Now with gamification, you do have to be conscious of the learner's level of expertise and how much instructions you need to provide for the game. A more novice learner may need more instruction than a more advanced learner. Those are some things that are all tied back to theory as well that are good to familiarize yourself with as you're designing these online experiences so that you can design them in a way that the learners can actually achieve the goals of the training. So another strategy is to place words close to relevant graphics. That's kind of one of those things where it's just easier for learners to follow graphics that are, labeled accordingly and placed close together. Removing non-essential content and presenting information via multiple channels. We've heard a lot of back and forth about learning styles. A lot of theorists are now saying that they're debunking the learning styles and saying that for an online experience, it's really best to target as many, multiple channels whenever possible so that you are not only keeping your learners' attention, but you are also, helping to reduce that extraneous load. So this is an example of a course where we've used an adaptive framework to kind of chunk the content, to segment the content into topics. This was like a test out feature. It kind of had a little bit of a social element to it as well because they were earning badges as they go. Here you can see some of the topics. So when they completed this assessment, it only required them to take the topics they did not test out of. So when they clicked continue, it would only show them the topics that they needed to see. They could go back and visit these other topics if they wanted to, but this adaptive framework allowed them to only have to sit through what they needed to see. That kind of targeted multiple cognitive elements, it reduced their overload as well as, making it very relevant to their level of knowledge. And this was an example done in Storyline. A lot of the tools, it's very possible to do this with triggers and a little bit of coding. This is an example of how placing graphics next to their corresponding labels or placing labels next to their corresponding graphics can make all the difference in the learner's experience. In this case, you know, had we just listed this out as like a checklist or a multiple choice question, it probably would not have been as engaging to the learner and as enticing as, you know, here they see the picture so they know what to look for when they go on that phone and they're placing this order on the app. In this case, what we were trying to teach them was the step-by-step process of placing a mobile order. So when they clicked on the phone, they got to walk through that process step by step. So, and, you know, in an online experience, especially these, just being cognizant of your pictures and your labels and making them very relevant to the learner, while also keeping them, you know, keeping them at as minimal as possible without overwhelming the learner. You get, you know, beyond your 7 plus or minus 2 magic number, then you do risk overwhelming the learner. So this theory kind of leads into the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which is another theory developed by Richard Mayer, where he emphasizes specifically the multimedia nature of a learning experience. And he talks about how people learn more deeply from pictures and words than by words alone. And for all of these, I have included the sources on the slides as well as toward the end in the notes panel. So whenever we post this, the sources of these are good sources to go back and read and find more detail about, because there's certain elements of these that I'm not going a lot into depth today just because of the limited time. So with multimedia learning, the goal is to, as with online learning, the goal is to use instructional media in a way that allows learners to build mental representations from the words and pictures. So the goal essentially is, as with cognitive learning, is to optimize that learning experience for the learner without overwhelming them. So if you look at this model, basically what Meyer was saying is that, you know, people use a combination of their senses to remember information and form those mental models that they need to transfer that to their long-term memory. So when you use a combination of sounds and images, as well as, you know, that verbal, you're targeting that verbal and pictorial mental model, which will go a long way than one or the other. So if you're using words without images, or even images without words, they just don't go as far as storing into that prior knowledge as the long-term memory, or as the combination of the two. Basically, the prior knowledge, when you use them in a way too that also relates back to their prior knowledge, that's when it really is stored in the long-term memory. So these, Meyer also goes into dual coding. This is kind of related to dual coding theory as well. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those, but those are like good things to go back and read as we post these resources, just to get a better idea of how those work. But basically the key points of those is that each channel has a limited capacity, but when you are organizing your content in a way that targets the multiple channels, there is a better likelihood that it will be stored in the learner's long-term memory. So these are just a few of Meyer's multimedia learning principles. There's 12 total, and actually that list is being expanded on, or has been expanded on, I believe, as well, to include additional others related to online learning by some other theorists. I did not include them today just because of limited time, but they are a good read if you have the time to go back and look that up. I have put some links, additional links at the end of this presentation for that as well. So in a multimedia as well as an online experience, we've talked about some of the strategies like coherence. Another one that you can use is signaling, and that's presenting cues to highlight main ideas in organization. One of those is maybe animating something in with the narration, but not word for word. And that's, I'll touch on that a little bit later. With narration, when you're narrating word for word, it tends to be distracting to learners. So we try to avoid that as much as we can. Other cues might be, a signal. Maybe you're having the learner interact with a coach as they're completing an activity, and if they complete something wrong, maybe there's a pop-up that an expert comes in and gives them an advice. That's another example of signaling or cueing. It's kind of a worked example where they're using that signaling and cueing to help them solve that problem and get to the next level. We've talked a little bit about the spatial continuity by placing printed words and graphics close together. Using relevant graphics is also another key here, as relevant as you can get to what they're learning. The more it will help them to make sense of that information and carry it back to the tasks that they need to perform, or back to the real world. Redundancy is kind of just touched on that a little bit about reading narration word for word. There is some theory behind that, that you will lose your learners if you narrate too much text word for word. Generally with that too, with it kind of ties back into segmenting. We try to limit, in an online experience, we try to limit narration to about a minute or less per slide, if we can help it at all. Because not only of the redundancy issue, segmenting and keeping the learner's attention, that's generally a baseline. Within that minute, something needs to happen, or after that, you go too long. It's kind of like a balancing act to manage the cognitive load in an online experience, because if you give the learners too much information and too little time, they can't process it mentally. If you give them too little information, then they're not learning enough to carry that back to their roles. So it really is something that you always have to be conscious of. Ways that you can keep them engaged and immersed in that experience without overwhelming them. One's pre-training is kind of a strategy too, something that you have to think about, especially as you're presenting things like videos, and that's what information does the learner need to know to understand what's being discussed in that video, to understand the main concepts. And that's with any media experience. I talked briefly before about worked examples. This is an example of a course where we kind of integrated the worked example approach throughout this whole experience, using just very real relevant steps in this sales process that was very relevant to their job. One of the kind of analogies that we used for this was anchor points. That was a sales tactic that they were familiar with, and they were things that their customers relied on. They were key sales features and benefits that their customers honed in on as they were trying to buy a boat. And so basically, the way I designed this experience was to follow these customers. This is one of the customers, Dustin and Isabella. We were actually fortunate enough to get very relevant pictures from this particular group. So it kind of helps to target that cognitive load as well, just by being more as relevant as we could get. So we basically took them through and followed two sets of customers, of their most common customers. One of them was a family couple, and was a couple that was buying a family boat, and then the other was a sportsman that was buying a boat for competitive fishing. And we walked them through very realistic, very relevant examples of, how they would sell the boat to these customers. And so even as we framed the content, using things like common anchor points, we framed it in terms from the customer's perspective, so that the sales reps could see intentionally, the concepts behind each step of the process as it was related to a real life customer scenario. So it just kind of took that into, it provided that worked example effect, while also immersing them into that deeper experience, that deeper relevant experience, and gave them tools that they could actually take back to the sales floor with them. This is kind of more of the worked example. This was an interaction that we developed where they were following Dustin and Isabella with specific questions to ask them related to their family as they were going through this what they called the needs assessment step of the sales process. They would ask customers questions to get familiar with what their needs were, so that they could select the right boat for them. And so what this activity is they're going through and asking the customers questions, and when the learner clicks on this, they can hear the question, and then they hear audio of the customer's response from using a different voiceover for the customer. So it kind of just took it to that deeper level, because it helped them to see it, from a real world perspective, how a customer might respond to questions like these. So this kind of is also how we built the experience up to where, the learner was actually able to complete steps of the sales process for other customers that we presented to them. So they had opportunities to practice on their own, which in the education realm, they would call this strategy scaffolding, where you're kind of building up to a point to where the learners can complete the tasks on their own. And that's another strategy that is applicable to online training as well. And then here's scaffolding as well, where in this example, the learner was interacting with one of the employees and an expert to answer questions. So if they needed help to identify words and phrases, they could click on an expert and get an expert's hint. that would kind of guide them through the process and through what steps they needed to take to complete the task. So collaborative learning is another tactic too that you can also use to reduce cognitive load in an online media experience. And that's through things like action planning, or, you could even link to your social media pages or your intranet site that has a discussion thread. One way would be to give your learners a set of questions, and they answer the questions, and then they can print that out and then take it back to their team or their manager, or you give them a set of questions and they go back to that discussion forum or whatever area that has been set up for them to answer those questions. But it is a great way to also hone in on sharing experiences, to hone in on the relevant, the authentic learning, which there's more theory tied to authentic learning as well, where you're making that experience more authentic and more relevant to the real world so that they can continue that learning beyond the learning experience. Cognitive aids are another tool that I use quite a bit to reduce that cognitive load in an online experience, especially if I get a project that has a lot of information that needs to be tied into a chunk of content or into a segment, into a learning segment. Providing job aids, not only provides them something tangible, provides the learner with something tangible that they can take back to their workplace. It also kind of it helps you address issues like issues with seat time and keeping courses less than 7, or keeping segments less than 7 minutes. It targets the visual channel in addition to the auditory. The auditory, it can be used to target that channel if depending on what type of aid is used. But it does allow you to keep that magic number 7 rule in mind as you're designing an experience. It provides that mechanism, that opportunity for you to give them something more without overwhelming them in the online experience. Infographics are a great tool to visually represent important concepts. Maybe you have steps in bits of information about customers that you want your employees to remember. An infographic is not a bad idea to present that. What your customers value. Maybe it's in this case, these were customers, the key pillars that were driving a customer's desire to purchase this ERP software, and so we were able to kind of break these down into a visual format that the sales reps could use as they were trying to sell this software, that they could see, clearly these are the common pillars that I can hone in on as I'm selling this product to a customer. The distributed solar example was another kind of example of where we just had a lot of information that a client wanted to present to a learner. But these were targeted, these were aligned with the objectives, but they were not crucial to be presented in the online course, and they were better presented in a visual format as a reference piece, and that the learner could kind of use learning to discover as they needed. In this case, it was a PDF that we were able to link things like videos and additional resources to, that the learner could just take at their own pace and learn about as they felt the need to. So there are several other related theories that I didn't go into a lot of detail today. One of them is social learning theory, which basically relies on the fact that people learn from one another by observing, imitating, and modeling. It's kind of, if you've heard me do a presentation or a webinar, you've probably heard me touch on this quite a bit, because social learning theory is one way to really take that learning experience to a much deeper level. As I did much of my ID degree online, and that really just sharing those stories and hearing from the experiences of other IDs was one way to really immerse me in a much deeper level. Whereas if I were sitting in a classroom, I might not have been as willing to openly share stories that I would have shared in an online discussion forum that were, had a facilitator to give you those cues and ask you those additional questions to facilitate that conversation and keep it flowing in a way that, allowed people to learn from the experiences of others. Situated cognition is another theory that I tend to keep in mind quite a bit as I'm designing an online experience, and it basically makes the point that knowledge is embedded in the activity, context, and culture in which they are learned. So it, unlike some of the other theories, takes into account the learner's environment. And that is something that can be forgotten when you're designing an online experience. That really goes back to, during your analysis phase, making sure you have a clear picture of the environment that you're designing for, including things that could potentially distract the learner from achieving the goals of the instruction. And that goes back to your interviews with your subject matter experts to try to get that information, as well as your learners, as much as you are able to. The culture, another thing with culture is, trying to make graphics as relevant as possible to the learner. If you're targeting an audience that wears primarily business casual attire, then presenting images that are suits and ties, it's probably not going to be the most relevant to them. And you may even turn off some learners, and that kind of goes back to it being a balancing act when you're trying to design an online learning experience, because you do have to consider not only how much information you're presenting, what types of imagery you present to be relevant in a way that's not going to turn your learners off and not going to distract them. The novice to expert theory is one that was actually developed by Patricia Benner, a nurse. It is also applicable to the workplace as well, though, because it takes into account the foundations by which, novice learners learn versus expert learners learn. When you're designing an experience for novice learners, which are basically learners with limited experience of the content, Then you'd want to present more instruction, more worked examples for the learners to work through, so that they can form the mental schemas that they need to get to that advanced stage. Versus for an expert learner, they would be annoyed by that additional instruction. So a tactic would be to present less instruction for them and let them do more problem solving. And I didn't go into a lot of the detail on these just because of the limited time, but I do have in the notes panel links to sources for more information about these. Cognitive behavioral theory is another theory that's focused more on the individual, learning from concepts that affect the behaviors they display, and that's where things like your learning activities, your reinforcement and your feedback come into play, and making sure that you are providing relevant feedback that targets the behavior and makes the learner want to change that behavior in a way that they need to achieve the performance objectives related to your learning goals. And I do have a little bit more information on each of these in the notes for this as well. And with that, that is just kind of the basic overview of cognitive theories and how they impact the design of a learning experience. It's kind of what areas that we as instructional designers can hone in on to use those to design a more immersive experience. As we close up, does anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments, or maybe ideas on how they could use cognitive theories to immerse learners in their organization in a deeper learning experience?
Well, this is really, really cool. We've got a lot of comments that are saying that they'd love the access to those resources. So we'll make sure that we make those resources available to you. Brandy, if you wouldn't mind putting that last slide up again. What we'd love to do, so we'll do our best to get this out to you guys later today. We'll try to get some of the resources as well as the recording of the session. And also, as Brandy will get up on the screen, you can email us to request a jam session. Maybe there's some of our instructional designers that can chat with you and find how we can help your organization get better. We'd love to also just chat about what you've got going on and see if we can offer some consultation to you. There's a couple comments and questions that have come up here, Brandy. The management almost always wants to add additional information to the training. What do you do about that?
So there's a couple different ways to approach it. One of them is I like to kind of approach it into a nice to know versus need to know strategy. If it's need to know, sometimes you don't have a choice but to chunk it, maybe on another slide or to add it to the course. If it's nice to know, some of the options are to add it as a job aid, as a cognitive aid, or maybe you are suggesting developing an additional advanced lesson or advanced course on a topic. When you're using tools like Storyline, you can set up scenes and segment those lessons into smaller chunks, and that will help your learners kind of sort that information out, sort that overload out as well. Sometimes you do have to kind of have that conversation with your subject matter experts and your managers that are giving you that feedback to prioritize the content, because sometimes you'll have conflicts with, they'll say, hey, you can only have this amount of seat time. but you're getting feedback on you having to add that additional content, so they have to sacrifice something else. So that's when you really have to go back and look at your learning goals too, and make sure that what they're adding is aligned with the learning goals. And maybe you have to narrow down the learning goals at that point if it gets to be too excessive.
Great. Another one is, how do you facilitate social learning and interaction among learners in online learning?
So there are actually a lot of different ways. I did an ELBX presentation on social learning as well. So one of the ways to do it in online learning is to embed links, like links to your social learning platforms or to your social media platforms directly in your e-learning course as a web object. Storyline will let you do that. You would basically set up your questions in the course for the learner to answer, and then link them to your social media site to share their experiences that way. There are social polling is another thing that can be embedded as a web object and linked to an outside site that will, keep track of that in real life and give you the graphs and the some sites will give you detailed graphs of how the learners compare with other learners. Both, I believe Captivate will also let you do that too, as far as embedding them as web objects. In my ELBX presentation, there are examples of how we have done that as well.
Awesome. So if that hasn't been published already, I'm sure it will be published soon. And again, we can make those resources available to those who have registered for today's session. That's all the time we have. So the information there on the screen, you can send an email to info@elearningbrothers.com. Of course, you can visit elearningbrothers.com and see a lot of the custom work that we've done, maybe get some ideas. But we also have people that would love to just chat about what your projects are and give you some consulting on and ideas on how to make them better. So you can send us an email and we'll try to get you to the people that can help you best. Thank you so much, Brandy. Thanks everybody for visiting us, and we hope we'll see you guys next time.